because that is what ADHD core is and what it demands. So yeah, I figured why not? I'm trying to do more lives on all of my platforms. Have yet to find a way to stream like everything all at once on multiple platforms. So I can only do like one phone thing like Instagram or TikTok and then like either Facebook or YouTube. So I've done like 2 lives today. I'm going to do them on different topics though, because I did one on Instagram and Facebook and then one on here. There's been a lot of stuff going on in the horse world lately. So I think that stuff is important to talk about and just welfare wise. And then also, I don't know, like updates on what I've been up to and stuff because things have just been hectic. Um, I've been trying to do more stuff like on my YouTube channel for the people who like watching pre-film stuff. That is the place to be. TikTok, I have honestly just like let it just not like take much of a back burner because it's no offense TikTok people, it's one of my least favorite platforms. But I've been trying to do lots of stuff talking about like prevalent issues in the horse world and like welfare stuff leading up to the 2024 Olympics because I'm still working on the campaign with the Alliance for Horse Welfare and Sport, where we're trying to make policy change leading up to the 2024 Olympics. And that's coming up really soon. And like, unfortunately, we still are just continuing to see hyperflexed horses being rewarded to the tune of like 88% in dressage disciplines and all sorts of crappy things just being enabled across the board in equine competition. So I try to do these videos because like I do understand that on like some of my shorter, especially on TikTok, on my shorter videos, people don't necessarily get like a very in-depth perspective on like what my actual thoughts on things are. And then assumptions are made. And also even on YouTube, people will watch like 3 seconds into a video and be like, oh, so like you hate all horse sports and you think that horseback riding should be illegal. And it's like, wow, that is quite the conclusion to jump to. Didn't say that at all, but fantastic imagination. Fantastic. But like realistically, like I think one of my biggest frustrations with people in the horse world is the fact that there's no nuance allowed. People think that if you criticize the status quo of anything, that you must hate it entirely and believe that it cannot be fixed. When that's not the case at all. Like I think that if you really love something and you believe in it, you should be willing to look for ways to improve it. And like I'm of the mind with like people, like we make mistakes and the horse industry has been around for a long time. And the idea that we have set it up in such a perfect manner that there's no need for improvement ever, I think is so flawed and it inhibits so much growth. So when I make videos talking about welfare issues, it's not to like vilify people or be like, all these people hate their horses, like people who show their horses don't love them. Nothing like that, because I think the vast majority of people, even ones who do crappy things, actually do love their horses, but there's so much normalized violence and mistreatment in the industry that even people who really do love their horses can't necessarily do the right thing because they're taught to literally not do it. And they're taught to have a completely skewed view from the reality. And there's very little quality control. So in making posts, my hopes are to just plant seeds in people's heads and make them think and just make them reconsider certain things, because in order to increase horse welfare and rider safety, we do need to kind of take a hard look at normals in the industry and make changes accordingly. And it's not a bad thing. It doesn't mean that people have to feel guilty or that you're a bad person if you have made mistakes, because who hasn't? Like, honestly, like, I think one of the reasons why I'm so outspoken about things that I would like to see changed in the industry is because I used to be guilty of a lot of the things that I criticize now. And like I did them while loving my horses the entire time. So it's not like a mindset where it's like, oh, like I'm so much better than you, I've never made a mistake. It's actually quite the opposite. Like, and a lot of the people consuming my content, because they feel attacked by what I say, they like to create the narrative that it's like a superiority thing where it's like, I'm so much better than you because I've never done it. It's like, no, I've been guilty of it. And that's why it makes me go insane, because I see all of these riders who love their horses being taught to do things that their horse does not, in fact, love. And they're causing their horses harm. They're endangering themselves. They're risking like long-term injury in some cases, depending on the practice. And it's very frustrating to watch when you're looking at it through the lens of like these people all love their animals and they don't want to cause them harm. And watching people cause harm, even when that's not their intention, and be told that it's totally fine when it's not, is something that I find very concerning. So, like, a lot of the content I post is for that purpose. And, like, I think that part of the toxicity in the horse world honestly comes from trainers, where a lot of us are taught this mindset where it's like, we're taught essentially that, like, if you do something bad, your value is reduced. If you make a mistake, your value is reduced. A lot of people have had trainers like this, where it's like, if you aren't riding well today, I'm going to make you feel like garbage and you don't hold as much value because you're not listening to me, you're not riding your horse to my standards, etc. Like, you're made to feel less valued as a person because of your trainer's perspective on you. So the idea of being wrong is like drilled into us from a very early age, that it's like something to be very ashamed of, and that it means we're less valued and that we don't deserve the same love and appreciation as someone who doesn't make mistakes. And then what this leads to is that people defend and defend and defend practices that don't actually serve them and that are actually harmful to both themselves and their horses, because they feel that admitting they were wrong about something is like the most shameful thing that they could do. And I think that a lot of it honestly is like a trauma response from people that they might not even be aware is happening. Because for me, that's what it was. Like, speaking from experience, I had trainers who were really, really nasty about things. Like, they would take out their frustration for being unable to explain something that I could follow the directions of. They would take out that frustration on me. And it would become my problem, like their frustration. And they would make me feel like crap, and like it was like something within me that wasn't good enough, that was resulting in me being unable to do what they were asking, even if they weren't explaining it well. It would be things like if my horse was really stressed or having a bad day, or like there was something going on that was making them very spooky, the horse's behavior would become my problem, even if it was the result of the instruction that they were giving me. And they would use the horse's behavior to be like, see, this is why you're not doing what I say, because your horse is misbehaving. When really, honestly, like, the responsibility falls on the trainer to alter the lesson accordingly. If their student is struggling, whether it is the student being unable to do what they are asking, no matter how well explained it is, or if it's because the horse is having a bad day or whatever, it's the trainer's responsibility to make adjustments accordingly rather than blaming the student. But what we have is we have an industry full of a lot of people who don't have much understanding of how to teach, and also don't really understand enough of what they're teaching in enough detail to properly explain it. They kind of just tell you what to do in the moment rather than why you're doing these things and how they work. And then you don't get the full story. And then if you can't follow through with it well enough, then you're still blamed. So we have people who handle horses in an unkind, impatient way, and then they also handle their students in that way. And it just creates this perpetual trauma, because even amongst humans, like, I've um I've noticed that with humans in the horse world, there's a lot of like toxic and abusive behavior that we encourage and enable amongst humans. Like, we will say that it's just tough love when trainers bully the absolute shit out of their students, and that that's how it needs to be done, and that's how you learn, despite all of the research showing that stressing out people, especially children, does not in fact help them learn well. That's used as a justification. But also, what I've noticed in the horse world is that there's a very high degree of like flat out abusive behavior, be it verbal abuse, physical abuse, like sexual harassment, etc. There's a lot of racism. There's a lot of other means of oppression and cruelty that are outwardly enabled in the horse world. And if you speak out against it and say, I'm not comfortable with this feels wrong, then you're often made out to be the villain in that case, where it's like, oh, like, you're being a snowflake, you're oversensitive, da 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 da, rather than it being the fault of the system or the people who are in positions of power or responsibility and not dealing with it. And you see the same type of tactics used for students that don't initially want to do things to their horses that aren't kind. Like, for example, if your trainer tells you to whip your horse and you're not comfortable with it, a lot of trainers will then use the tactic of shaming you and saying that you're going to teach the horse bad habits, that this is all your fault, that you're being weak-minded, you're being oversensitive, that the horse won't even feel it. And like, they'll basically gaslight you into doing something that you're inherently uncomfortable with until you do it. And then that tactic, when repeated over the course of time, then results in you, one, not questioning people who are like superior to you, and two, having a lot of anxiety behind these things so that you then justify them when you find out that they're wrong. So for all the kids who have been bullied into whipping horses when they didn't want to initially do it, when they're then later as an adult met with the idea that it is unkind to your horse to be punishing in that way, they go into denial because they've been shamed into doing that. They've finally given in and repeated it over such a long time that they now accept it. And then they're faced with the idea that it was wrong the whole time. And then they can't sit with themselves and go, I'm not a bad person. This is what I was taught to do by someone I trusted. Instead, they go, I am terrible. If this is true, it means I'm an awful person. I'm an awful rider. I abuse my horse. My horse must hate me. And they can't separate the two because throughout the course of conditioning from their trainers, they've been taught to feel like everything is their fault and that they have to take full accountability for everything and that it inhibits their value if they make these mistakes. So then they just double down and they defend these things that they usually initially started out knowing were wrong and weren't comfortable with. And yeah, exactly. Like we're bullied for being too nice. You're told that you're just gonna be like a pushover. Like my trainer used these tactics on me from the time I was like 4 onward. It would be stuff like, oh, if you're too nice to them, you're gonna give them bad habits and then they could hurt me and it'll be your fault or they'll hurt another student. And it's like giving responsibility that at its core is the responsibility of the trainer to not overface their students in the first place and to also notice when horses are behaving dangerously and address it, but making the student feel guilty for not complying with something or feel guilty for being too soft when in reality, like, if being too soft and too mellow and too kind is your go-to, that's actually something that's really good to work with. If your go-to is being too strong and aggressive, that's a lot harder to work with because softening someone who responds with anger and like high levels of negative emotions is going to be much harder than teaching someone who is really soft and sensitive to be maybe a little bit more firm. But honestly speaking, a lot of these really soft, considerate riders don't really have a problem, but they're made to feel like they do. And then you're given so much value when you put yourself in dangerous situations, when you ride horses through really dangerous behaviors where they're freaking out and responding to pain and stress. You're made to feel like you are like a god. You're told you're the best for being able to stay on, and you're made to feel like that is how you gain value in the horse world. So then it becomes this thing where it's like, I am a better rider if I'm able to ride more stressed horses and stay on and ride them through that stress instead of looking at it and going, I am a better rider and horse person if I'm able to help horses through their stress and not have these behaviors perpetually reoccur. And honestly, that's what I'm most impressed by is the riders that can consistently have calm horses that, or even if they do get overwhelmed, that can sit with the horse and help bring them down and not just be riding them through stress until the horse fatigues and stops behaving in a stressed manner. Those riders are the ones that are going to be the most promising because they're actually affecting emotional change in the horse rather than using physical exhaustion as a means of handling stress. And yet, those are the very types of riders that, when they're paired with these types of trainers, are made to feel ashamed of themselves and like they're not good enough because they're not willing to just ride horses through stuff. And we see it too, where it's like we glorify danger. The rider who is bucked off a horse and might be hurt is told to get immediately back on, regardless of their hurt, how hurt they are. Like there's that famous saying, I'm pretty sure it's from George Morris, where it's like, "Oh, you can either go to the hospital or get back on, hospital or on." But like, there's lots of types of hurts that you're not going to be hospitalized for, that you don't need to be hospitalized for, but that you need a freaking break for. And people are made to feel like they are a worse rider for not for taking that break and for not just getting on again, even if they are injured, even if they are compromised. If your body is sore to the point where you cannot ride effectively, or you're so shaken that it'll impact your ability to safely ride, and you've already been on a horse that has thrown you and made you feel unsafe, it is a smart decision to go, I need to take a breather, even if it's like a short break and you get back on them later. But like, we're shamed for not getting back on too, and we're encouraged into dangerous situations because it's viewed as shameful and bad and like teaching the horse bad habits to not get back on. And like, here's the thing is like, once you've fallen off, like if the horse is finding the act of you falling reinforcing, and that is what's reinforcing the behavior, whether you get back on them or not, the behavior has already been reinforced because once they get you off, if that was their goal and it relieves them of whatever stressed them out to the point of throwing you, they've already been reinforced for that. So whether you get back on or not on that day, the behavior has already been reinforced regardless of what decision you make. It's not going to cause long-term harm to the horse's training to take a break and not get back on, or to do groundwork instead. But there's this notion that's drilled into our heads from the very beginning of our riding careers that if you don't get back on your horse after you fall off, that it's a very, very bad thing. When really a lot of times doing groundwork is totally acceptable, or taking a break and coming back to things when you and your horse are both in a better headspace. But we're made to feel ashamed about it. So then over time, what we have done is we've created this culture where danger is glorified and encouraged, and where you're made to feel like you are a superior rider to people who aren't willfully placing themselves in positions of danger simply because you perpetually endanger your horse and manage to live through it. And it's something that is so prevalent that you can see it across all types of disciplines. It's not a discipline specific thing. It's also really prevalent here on TikTok, where a lot of the videos that get the most attention and views are people who are riding through dangerous situations. And they get a ton of attention for it. They're told they have a great seat, they're a great rider, that they can manage like such a difficult horse. And then they're therefore encouraged to have more of these situations, whether they consciously realize it or not. And it's one of those things where like those situations can be fun to laugh at until something really bad happens. And also when you're not actually leveling with like how the horse might be experiencing that situation. Like if you have a perpetually stressed horse, it's not a nice state of mind. Like, I don't know, a lot of us who are online have chronic anxiety, or at least like high levels of anxiety in certain situations. And I'm sure anyone with anxiety can speak for the fact that it's not a comfortable place to be. It's inherently uncomfortable. You don't like it. It ruins your ability to enjoy certain environments, and it can impact your sleep, and it can impact all sorts of things in your life. It impacts how your stomach feels. It impacts whether you get headaches. It can cause breakouts, etc. It impacts so many different facets of your life that it's just not a nice place to be. And yet we downplay how impactful chronic anxiety is with horses. And like what I will say is that we don't have the same amount of research on like chronic anxiety and trauma and the impact it has on the physical health of animals. But we do have quite a bit of that type of research on people. And there's a pretty clear link between chronic anxiety and trauma and other physical issues, be they autoimmune disorders, digestive issues, etc. There's a very clear link to it, and it can actually like shorten your lifespan and also cause a lot of other issues to develop because of that. And we're mammals, horses are mammals. As far as I'm concerned, there's not really any reason at this point to pretend that stress isn't expensive and potentially harmful to the body. And yet, we don't really value the experience our horses might be having when it's a negative one that we are causing. To the person asking, is there a connection to chronic anxiety to a horse's lifespan? It hasn't been studied enough. And like, I don't think it will be until people actually start caring more about when their horse is anxious, because right now, putting money into research that would serve to make horse people feel bad for things that they can freely do without considering the outcome of them probably won't happen. A lot of the most researched things are the stuff that supports sporting events. If they were to research chronic anxiety in horses and prove that it caused welfare issues that were significant enough to lower lifespan or cause significant health issues, it would call into question the ethicality of sport in a way that I don't think people want to deal with. However, there's lots of research on human anxiety and trauma showing how it impacts the physical body. And I think the same would fall true for mammals, because there's not really a reason why it wouldn't. There's so many similarities between mammals' systems and how our bodies function. So I think that like if we're able to experience health issues from anxiety, and like there's bodily responses to anxiety and stress, there's no reason to assume it's not the same with horses, especially when you can look and you can see similar types of bodily responses. Like for example, when you're really, really anxious, you can get so sick to your stomach that you need to go to the bathroom, and it can cause you to like have diarrhea or throw up, etc. Horses can't throw up, but when they're stressed, they often defecate because they like are clearing out the system to run and have a flight response. They're also more likely to vocalize. They're more likely to experience aggression. They're more likely to have like colic or other health issues, for example, when they're chronically stressed. So there's a lot of similarities in terms of their response to anxiety that would basically favor the idea that they could have similar outcomes to chronic anxiety. Um, so it is wild, like how much we glorify horse stress and how riders on stressed horses, simply by way of staying on, are viewed as better riders. Because you should be viewed as a better rider for keeping your horse in an emotional state where they're most able to learn and retain information, and where they're most physically and mentally comfortable, rather than being applauded for your ability to simply ride through their stress. Um, it becomes like such a weird thing, because it's like, if you're a trainer that has tons of videos of you bucking out horses that you're starting under saddle, people are like, oh wow, you get such rank horses. You have such a good seat, you can ride through anything. And like, having a good seat and being able to ride through anything might be true, but if you're a trainer who is perpetually starting horses in a way where they explode and they bronc, something has to be said about how you're starting them. It doesn't matter how like rank they are. Like, if you're getting horses with known issues and you're throwing them so far over threshold that that is a theme in your training practice, you're not a better trainer than someone who trains in a way where the horse doesn't seem to be bothered by anything, because it doesn't mean that the horse didn't start out being bothered. I've gotten a lot of horses with issues that stem from chronic stress and being traumatized. And if I were to go about the way I handle them in as fast of a way as certain trainers do, then I would see the same types of responses. I would see them panic and get the same type of response from the horse, and it would be because I rushed it. It wouldn't be because the horse is any less or more rank than it was with like the softer means of starting them. So it's just such an odd thing. Someone asked, are some horses more prone to anxiety depending on the breed, bloodlines, etc.? I know it's blamed a lot. There's like some truth to that, because like generational trauma being passed down in certain personality traits is a thing. But what I see the most is that people will use bloodlines as an excuse for why their horse is anxious. And it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy where they act in a way that creates anxiety and they just blame it on the breeding, because like a lot of the bloodlines that have those anxieties are like more sensitive horses. And like, yeah, they're going to be more sensitive to people being loud and like mean and punishing to them, and they're going to be more reactive, but it's not the bloodline. Ultimately, it's the trainer that brings out those traits in them. And so like, regardless of bloodline, you shouldn't be using that as an excuse for behavior, because ultimately it's the way that you train, and training should be altered depending on the type of the horse. If the horse is more inherently sensitive, rather than expecting them to fit in a cookie cutter training method and be able to withstand the level of stress that other horses might be more resilient to, the trainer should be more considerate of them. Like, I've had a lot of bloodline, like with race horses, there's like quite a few. Like the Stormcat bloodline is like a big one where people are like, oh, like these horses are so high energy and stressed and like rank. And like, no, like they tend to be a more sensitive type, but I mean thoroughbreds in general are more sensitive horses. I've never had issues with them ever, provided I'm not really rough and loud in the way that I train them. And that applies to like all different types of bloodlines, because I've also seen a lot of people blame like the Balu Duru A lines in warm bloods for being buckers. And like, I mean, they're bred to be show jumpers, so they probably can throw bigger bucks of like that than other types of horses, because they're bred for it. So it's like athletic potential. And they might be have more blood in them, like more thoroughbred blood than other types of horses. But like, ultimately, it's like, if your horse is so stressed they're bucking all the time, there could be a physical issue, or there's something you're doing in your training that's bringing those traits out. Um, and it just takes off a lot of responsibility off of the person to hold themselves accountable, because like, it ultimately is our responsibility to bring the best out in our horses. And it's a very convenient excuse to just be like, oh, like it's just their breeding. And like, I've seen a lot of people do it where like, if I look at how their horse is living, it'll be situations like where the horse is, first of all, like stressfully weaned, ripped away from their parent cold turkey, and develops an intense fear and separation anxiety from other horses as a result. So then they're kept isolated in a paddock by themselves, away from other horses. They're not getting enough turnout. This is a young horse that isn't getting its needs met. And then it might end up having displaced aggression, anxiety, spookiness, and other traits that come about that are then blamed on the bloodline, when really it's just how the environment impacted the horse. And sensitive bloodlines are more likely to be more highly stressed by things that other, like, duller bloodlines might be able to tune out a little bit more, but that's just a difference in resilience. It doesn't change the fact that the circumstances themselves are still stressful. It's just a difference in how the horses are able to withstand that level of stress, which is why some horses might be able to cope with being stalled 24/7 without developing stress behaviors to cope with it, whereas others get incredibly neurotic and can't cope with it in the same way despite the fact that they're experiencing the same environment. And it's just a difference in stress. It doesn't change the fact that the situation is stressful, even for the horse who is not as outwardly obvious in their types of stress. Like my thoroughbred mare that I have, Harlow, she never developed any stall vices at the racetrack. So she would just stand and be relatively quiet in her stall. She didn't weave, she didn't crib or anything. But under saddle and like when you're leading her and handling on the ground, incredibly stressed horse, very, very stressed. So it's not that she like enjoyed being in a stall more than any other horse at the track who might develop stress behaviors, but she just found a different way of coping with that specific stressor than what another horse might. And like I think like anything like that where it's like we blame the horse's rankness, their breeding, their age, their color, their gender, anything, like I view that as an excuse on the part of the trainer to try to deflect how they're contributing to the issue. Ultimately, like the common denominator is usually the person. They're either not noticing potential pain issues that are causing the horse grief, or they're ignoring stress issues and hyperinflating stress issues by not being considerate of the horse's feelings, and kind of just making a mockery of it. Like the fact of the matter is how we value a lot of training is like people's ability to make horses do things regardless of how it is attained. So the more someone can make a horse do, they're viewed as a better trainer even if the horse is so shut down during all of that, simply because they're able to compel the horse to do things. When really like we should be valuing trainers that can teach horses how to do things, but that in a way the horse feels good about, that the horse wants to do the thing, and that they're calm, they're happy, and they're not like shut down, that they're still engaged with the environment. These are the types of value systems that we should really be having, especially in an industry where we claim to value the horse first and foremost. Because if that is true, how the horse feels about the training should be of the utmost importance, and honestly often isn't. And you can see that with how people react to those who are more concerned about how the horse feels. You're mocked and made fun of for being like a sensitive little snowflake and for um like applying emotions to horses. But like ultimately there's a reason behind every behavior. Like horses don't just do things for the sake of doing them. Like they're responding to stress when they're being bad, or they're responding to pain, and there's a reason for it, even if it's uncomfortable for the person to acknowledge that reason. And we would be able to train better and just do so much better by our horses if we actually acknowledge the reasons behind their behavior instead of shrugging them off and oversimplifying them and taking them personally. Like taking their behavior personally is like one of the worst things you can do. And it can definitely be hard not to sometimes, especially if you've had a bad day and you're stressed. You're more likely to redirect and deflect your anger and stress onto your horse. But that doesn't mean that it's okay. And like learning how to catch those behaviors in yourself and hold yourself more accountable will also make you a better trainer. Like it is such an easy out to just be like, oh, like this horse is from this bloodline. This is why the way they are. But like if you can bring out the best in a horse despite their history, despite their bloodlines, and despite how prone to anxiety they might be, that speaks more for your ability as a trainer than it does to just like create the self-fulfilling prophecy of stress in the horse because of how you rush through training. And like to be frank, like a lot of what we expect from horses is like so skewed and like ridiculously unfair, the standard that they're held to. Like they're expected to cope with perpetually not having their needs met, and not only just like cope with it, but also cope with it without having any inconvenient outward reactions that impact people's ability to use them for whatever our goals are. So for example, the horse who's stalled 24/7, never turned out, and is frustrated and stressed because of that, if they then react under saddle in a way that the rider doesn't like, they're still blamed for that behavior. It's viewed as bad behavior, and it's viewed as a shortcoming of the horse and something that needs to be trained out of them, even if it's an environmental response. And we expect them to be able to cope with like unfair treatment that people apply to them, along with stressful situations, uncomfortable tack, um, equipment that might cause them pain, and so on and so forth. They're expected to deal with all of the above and then never inconvenience us with their reactions. When you look on it at the flip side, it's like if you missed a meal a day, or like if you haven't eaten all day, you're way more likely to snap at people and be pissy with them, even if you ate the day before. If you are chronically under socialized and under fulfilled in your life, you're more likely to be angry and resentful towards other people. And yet that's like the reality of life that a lot of horses experience. Like they're chronically not having their needs met. And then when they respond to that lack of need being met, they're then also blamed for that response, instead of people looking and going, what could have caused this? And this is like an industry wide problem that we don't really acknowledge or care about enough. Um, and it's something that we need to start caring about, because it's like next to impossible to be a good horse owner and a good trainer without actually valuing how your horse might feel about things and like why they might be behaving the way that they do. Um, so it's just something that, like, in the effort of improving welfare, we do need to start to consider why horses might be doing what they're doing, instead of just viewing it as such a personal inconvenience that we then want to punish them for it. Because it doesn't actually help. Like, a lot of the horses who end up having really dangerous long-term issues are ones that have been punished the most. And like, if punishment was a really effective means of modifying behavior, we wouldn't have a lot of horses that end up shut down and super, super dangerous. And like it's just one of those things where like we see these issues repeating themselves again and again and again, but people are in denial of like what factors are contributing to it, and they don't want to accept it. Like, I wish that people who thought that their horse's lack of turnout doesn't contribute to their behavior would literally just try giving their horse adequate turnout for like 2 weeks and see how vastly different their behavior would be, because it would be so eye-opening that they would not be able to ignore it anymore. Um, or like any factor that might be contributing to their horse's behavior. Like if your horse has ulcers, for example, like treating the ulcers and dealing with the cause of their stress, the amount of difference that it can have in your rides is huge. And the more people see that, the more able they'll be able to really understand why their horse is behaving the way that they are. But like, people downplay the amount of change that addressing the cause of a horse's stress behavior might bring. And they overinflate the value of training, because like training is important, but like ultimately like environment and husbandry is way more important. um Being able to like train out issues that stem from like environment and like lack of fulfillment in the animal's life is akin to like either physically exhausting them or shutting them down in some capacity, because it's like it's not, you're not actually dealing with what's causing the issue, so you're not actually solving it. um and yeah, someone on YouTube said, can we also talk about how insensitive it can be to yell at another being, including a horse, on how the thing they're afraid of is not scary? What might not be scary to us may be scary to another being. And like, this is totally true. It's invalidating. Like, for the horse, it's not going to necessarily be invalidating in the way a person might experience, because they're not going to understand what you're saying. But ultimately, it's like the horse is a flight animal. They have a completely different ability to see the world than we do. And the way their brain works is so colossally different that it is so egotistical and just wrong and off-putting to project how we perceive things, because their brain categorizes objects differently based off of how they're oriented, which is why like when the bucket they're used to walking past is turned over on its side, they might spook at it at that point, or in different lightings they might spook at different things, because that is how their brain works. The other important thing to note about horses in specific is that as flight animals, their amygdala is highly developed, and the amygdala is the portion of the brain that like responds to stress signals. So when you're highly stressed, the thinking part of the brain is actually bypassed and it goes right to the amygdala, which creates the moving reaction, which is why sometimes horses spook without thinking. Like, they literally haven't even processed what they're reacting to. They're just reacting, and that is what keeps them safe as a flight animal, because if they didn't do that, they would have gotten picked off by predators. And this is also why their brain categorizes things differently, because predators have camouflage. If they just looked at every rock they walked by and went, that is definitely a rock, they would get attacked by the predator hiding behind it. They have to be inherently suspicious of the environment and notice any tiny little change in the environment in order to be safe as a flight animal. So it is of an evolutionary benefit, and the fact that it impedes our ability to use them for work doesn't change the fact that it makes total sense for how their brain works and how they're wired. And the lack of acceptance that people have for those types of things leads us to training them in a way that doesn't make any sense. Like, you cannot change how their brain works. Punishing them for fear is not going to make them less afraid. Just as like yelling at a child for being scared of something is not going to make them less afraid. At most, all you'll succeed in is teaching them that they need to suppress their emotions from you, but it won't change the internal experience. It'll just change how they show it outwardly, which in a lot of ways is worse, because if they repress that outward like sign of behavior, you're not going to get a warning when suddenly they feel so stressed that they need to just leave immediately. It's going to happen out of nowhere. Like, I firmly don't believe in the idea that horses respond to things out of nowhere and that they react out of nowhere unless like the stimulus that caused it is so overwhelming to them that they just like immediately react to it right away, like a bomb going off or something. But generally speaking, out of nowhere just means I wasn't perceptive enough to notice the earlier signs of my horse being overwhelmed, or I taught them to not show me those signs by punishing away the warning signs. They don't actually usually react out of nowhere. Like, there's been so many times that like I've seen horses slowly going over threshold, and I just like, if I'm not actively being paid to train the horse and I'm too far away to do something, I just have to sit back and watch it happen, and like I know that something dangerous is going to happen, and I can watch it slowly get to the point where the horse totally reacts and cannot cope. And then the people are like, wow, that happened out of nowhere. He spooked for no reason. It's like, no, you just didn't notice the reason. And that's like another lack of accountability on the part of the person to assume that you're so perceptive and good at reading horse behavior that the horse actually just reacted out of nowhere for no reason. That's only looking at it from your perspective. It's like if you have a significant other who's been pissing you off all day and just being really inconsiderate and not considering your feelings, the last straw that finally gets you to react might be a lot smaller than the other things that initially pissed you off. But your reaction is not going to just be because of that last straw. It's going to be because of all of the little stressors that have slowly stacked over the course of time that have led you to having no patience with them. And then you respond. And even with people, you might get it where they're like, oh, like you're overreacting. Why are you being so dramatic and emotional? But you're responding to an issue that has been perpetually pissing you off over the course of time, or like scaring you, making you anxious, making you stressed. And you're finally at the point where you can't take it anymore. And then that's where you react. And people often only look at the reaction and they respond to the reaction rather than looking at what might have led it there. And this is something that I think that a lot of women or female presenting people can relate to, where like when you do finally react, oftentimes your reaction is viewed to be a bigger problem than what caused the reaction. And we do this to animals all the time, especially horses. And it's especially funny with horses that as a flight animal, we have these high standards for them because it's like just like unrealistic and just like totally out of touch with reality on how they function as creatures. Like, we should be far more understanding of how they function and know what animal we're dealing with instead of going into training and handling flight animals and then being pissed off when they act like flight animals. And like, I speak for my past self, I speak for a lot of people in the industry. Like, a lot of people are annoyed and frustrated and upset with their horse when they behave like a horse. And it's like, don't get a horse. Don't work with flight animals if you don't want to deal with an animal that is more likely to be afraid of things. Like, it's a very poor choice in an animal to get. If you want to just be able to swing a leg over something and have it obey your every command without any issue, get a dirt bike. But even then, it might have a mechanical failure that you need to deal with. And if you ignore the sounds and the signs leading up to that mechanical failure, you're in the same boat. But getting a flight animal and then being upset when they are afraid of things, absolutely insane mindset to have. And also viewing it as a shortcoming of a trainer to not be able to make the horse totally not afraid of anything, insane mindset to have, because that is called a shutdown horse. Like, creating a horse that no longer reacts to the environment no matter what, that's not the result of good training. That's the result of trauma. They should react to the environment. But a horse that is self-regulating well when they react to the environment, it's probably going to look more like flinching and then standing in spot and like looking to their person for guidance. It's not going to look like them rearing up and flipping over and totally freaking out because they're going to be more regulated. But horses can and should still react to the environment, and their doing so is not a statement on how good or bad of a trainer that someone is. Because like, you can't expect them to be a robotic creature. With that said, people can't use that what I just said there to justify a chronically stressed horse who is reacting bigly to the environment all the time in a disproportionate way. If your horse is always so stressed that they're bronking, bucking, bolting, rearing, and that is something that you've come to just view as normal, that's a problem. If it happens every now and then, okay, but if it's something that you deal with every ride that you have to use harsher and harsher equipment to cope with, then it's something that you really should care about fixing. So it's like a double-edged sword where it's like you should be trying to mitigate your horse's stress wherever possible, but at the same time you can't expect them to not never behave like a horse because they're a flight animal and that is how their brain works. And it's also important to keep them low threshold and in a state of mind where they're not chronically stressed. If you don't want them to react in a way where they suddenly have this big huge reaction to a stressor where they're not actually processing what happened, they're just going immediately to the amygdala and then responding in movement. So, like, yeah, if you want your horse to be the most reliable and consistent and safe to be around, teach them that they don't need to fear you. Because if they start to associate you with getting in trouble when they're afraid, anytime their anxiety starts to build, they're just going to get more anxious because they're going to be like, oh God, I'm going to get in trouble soon. I'm feeling the same way that I always do when she yells at me or hits me. And then they're going to get overwhelmed easier until you might successfully shut them down, at which point they no longer show you how they are feeling and then they just react and explode and are dangerous and react out of nowhere because you've taken away the warning signs. And if they feel safe around you and they view you as a safe place and a person who's not going to overwhelm them and make them feel in danger, even when they start to get really overwhelmed, they're more likely to self-regulate and be safer than you. Is it a completely 100% foolproof method? No, because horses aren't robots, but neither is hitting them and beating them for their like reactions. You're way more likely to get ahead and have a consistently self-regulated horse by being a safe place that they can trust and someone that they can trust to not overwhelm and scare the crap out of them than you are to be someone that stresses the heck out of them and makes it inherently scary to be afraid, where they get more punished because they are afraid. Um, and it should just be a logical thing, but unfortunately, again, this goes back to how we're taught to value and view horses. Unfortunately, a lot of us are taught that it's the shortcoming of a rider or a trainer to not successfully stop a flight animal from being a flight animal. It's ridiculous. It's so silly. But anyways, I gotta go and refill my water bottle, so I'm gonna sign off because I think my phone for the TikTok live is going to die in a second. This live will be saved on my YouTube channel if you want to rewatch it if you joined late. My YouTube channel is just my name, Shelby Dennis, or if you look up Milestone Equestrian, it'll also come up if you want to watch the live from the beginning. And then I also just do other types of videos on these same types of topics. So thank you to everyone who listened, and I hope you have a great day. And this will be on my YouTube. Bye, TikTok. And YouTube people. I'm going to try to do more of these. So I always appreciate the support on my YouTube page. It means a lot to anyone who likes, watches, comments, shares my videos. It's really helpful. It helps me continue doing what I do. So I really appreciate it. I've been uploading a lot more, so there might be a lot of videos that people miss because my YouTube doesn't like to send people post notifications for some reason. So I recommend checking those out. And yeah, anyways, have a good night, and I hope everyone stays safe out there and just is more considerate of their horses. So bye-bye.